Ora si registrerà la conferenza.
So it is impossible for her to present this webinar. And so I am Daniela Costa. I will present this very interesting paper. Thank you for us to join to this webinar. It's the seventh webinar of the cycle of webinar, 10 webinar of the conference Council esma bocconi. The topic of the webinar are corporate governance sustainability. The topic is very interesting, and in particular interesting because this paper analyzes the relationship between investor and manager myopia and particular short-termist behavior in the market, and shareholder proposal to environment and social issues. So it's a topic very interesting for regulator, and for this reason, this webinar is very important for us. And the paper presented will be the paper. The author of the paper is Helen. Thank you, Helen, for accepting this invitation. And the paper will be discussed by Professor Petrella Giovanni, Cattolica University. So the time is it's very fast. So I think that we can open this webinar. Please, Helen, present your very interesting paper. The title of the paper is risk and shareholder voice. Please.
Okay, thank you, Daniela, for the introduction. I will straight share my screen.
Okay.
Okay, we can see my screen, I think.
Yes, perfect. Helen, it's perfect.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Thank you for accepting our paper and organizing this event for us to share ideas. And it's grateful. We're very grateful for your comments and suggestions. So this is a joint work with Bige from Oxford and Michelle from Drexel University. And I am Ellen, and I'm a research fellow, presidential fellow of University of Manchester. So this paper was really motivated. Me and Bige were discussing after reading all these headlines, looking at firms talking about environmental and social issues that they face. Investors are demanding firms to make more sustainable approach to things and to care about more social or labor issues, etc. And we start to think it's an important question to understand how we should view these issues, why they matter for firms. So the consensus is that environmental and social issues, they matter for companies in terms of reducing certain financial risks. And there are actually a lot of papers already looking at how the ES perspective of the firm is related to their financial risk. And the traditional approach is to use a proxy for the environmental and social issues a firm faces, or some strength, environmental social strengths the firm has, and then relate that to firm performance and risk measures, etc. So immediately we see this survey paper by Gibson et al. They look at the rating agency, their ratings. They look at the correlation of these 5 major ones, their correlation with the Sustainalytics ratings. And they plot this, and we did a calculation on average the correlation of all these rating agencies take on firms' environmental and social score. The correlation is only 46% on average. That shows there is a huge discrepancy even among these professional ES rating agencies to proxy for a firm's environmental and social practices. So that shows if our input, the proxy for ES, is not so agreeable among professionals, how are we going to draw anything conclusive in terms of whether ES contribute to reduce firms' risk or not? So we take a different approach in this paper. We look at from the investor's perspective. And for the two reasons. One is investors are actually asked to decide on a firm's ES practices. We know shareholders, they can submit shareholder proposals to be voted upon in annual meetings. And many shareholders, large ones such as mutual funds, they have this fiduciary duty to decide on whether the firm should take these initiatives or not. So the number of ES proposals among all shareholder proposals in terms of numbers is actually quite high, about 1/4. So the shareholders have this fiduciary duty to decide on ES, and there is a large number of ES issues to be decided upon. So that's one reason we think from a shareholder perspective might be useful. Another is they are shareholders, therefore they invest in those firms. So they have the so-called skin in the game. Therefore, they have the incentive to look into these ES issues and make informative decisions. So looking at shareholders' take on ES issues and then see how that is related to firms' future ES or financial risk is perhaps a better approach. So that's our take. And of course, there are some concerns against why we shouldn't look at shareholders. One is, do shareholders have sufficient high quality information to make informed decisions? Hopefully with the help of professional proxy advisors such as ISS, they can, when they make decisions on ES proposals, maybe they are better informed. But another issue is also, even if they have good quality information, can they still make the optimal decisions? Maybe not, because we know ES issues are difficult to evaluate and also somewhat seems to be long-term issues. So if investors, they have a different agenda, they focus more on the short-term outcome, they might suffer from this agency issues to not pass these ES, to not vote for these ES issues, therefore leading to problems. So with these positivities, why we should look at shareholders, and with these concerns behind, we look into a few questions in the space. So here is the outline of our paper. So I'm taking a slightly different approach. Instead of telling us what our findings are, etc., I'd like to take you through these three main sections of our paper. So first of all, we said the shareholders are to decide on ES. Then what are the ES to be decided upon? So we give some descriptive statistics to look at these ES proposals. And then the most important part is to look at whether those mutual fund or those shareholders, their take on ES are informative or not. And we look at from a risk perspective. So we look at the firm's future risk and also firm's ES incidents. And then we have said there are some obstacles preventing them from making the optimal choice. And then we investigate whether these investors, especially mutual funds, do suffer from these obstacles, such as short-termism or other agency issues. So that's the outline of my presentation today. So the first part, we're all interested in those shareholder proposals on ES, and many of us have the perception that maybe those proposals are really not to the standard, so-called rubbish proposals. Therefore, very up to now, researchers only now start to look at into these proposals. So we first did a summary of who are the sponsors of these proposals. This gives us some insights of whether they are actually rubbish proposals or whether they are proposed by concerned shareholders who can make sophisticated decisions and who are also value oriented implemented. And we indeed find that actually the majority, over 50% of these proposal sponsors are asset management companies. So they're not random individual who is an activist in environmental social issues and then just push all sorts of agenda to firm that is unrealistic. They are actually managing money managers. And the top 5 asset management companies that submit these proposals are the large pension funds or some social funds. But nonetheless, they are all managing money and they are fairly sophisticated. And then we also have a quarter of religious groups who are pushing ES agendas, and a quarter of other institutions such as NGOs, unions, or individuals. So this just gives us an overview of who these sponsors are. And then if we're looking to the actual content of these proposals, it gives us a better idea of whether these proposals make sense or are completely rubbish. So here we summarize in terms of the proposal numbers, the top 5 most popular proposal categories sponsored by asset management companies. And you find that many of them are actually reporting on certain issues, adopting certain policies, or improve certain policies, etc. And even if we look at proposals by other groups, religious group or others, in terms of the popularity of different proposals, they are all sort of relatively similar, and they cover both environmental and social issues as well. So by the look of just visual observation, it doesn't seem to be too outlined. So it looks like these proposals can make some sense. So then we look at the most important figure here is 2 numbers. One is the fund support of these ES proposals averaged each year. And we can see that at the beginning, when the funds are starting to disclose their voting positions, there's only about 5% support among mutual funds on each ES proposals on average. And throughout the years, it actually increased to almost 20%, but the value is still very low. But if we look at a professional body that gives voting guidelines, voting recommendations, the Institutional Shareholder Service, ISS, their supporting rate originally is also not very high, but over the years, it has increased to over 60%. And the most interesting thing is the gap between these two is actually increasing. And we know from past research papers, the funds are always likely to track the ISS. It is actually quite surprising that the funds are not supporting these ES proposals as much as the ISS. And this discrepancy here, we don't see in other proposals such as management sponsored proposals or other things, which you may find a plot in the paper as well. So this gives us a puzzle why over the years the fund support is increasing but not as fast as the ISS. What's the implication there? Or are these support making sense? And the lack of support here, does it mean something else? So another observation is, because the low support rate among shareholders, we have over 1,600 proposals, ES proposals, but only less than 1% of them ever get past of the 50% threshold. So only a handful of proposals that actually get passed throughout the years. So an overview of these summary statistics of the proposal tell us there is a lot of shareholder proposals related to ES issues, and many of them are sponsored by asset management companies. And although the support among shareholders to these proposals is increasing, but not high enough, therefore almost none ever get passed. So that leads to the second part of our analysis, is to look at whether these support over the years still is informative or not. And we form 2 hypotheses here. One is these proposals are just motivated by some non-pecuniary factors, Maybe there are some individuals who are pursuing some ethical or social agendas, not really focusing on value maximization, and shareholders know it, therefore they never, or the majority never ever voted for these, therefore these proposals never pass. And that could be true, and that's many people's perception. But then it could be another hypothesis, which is some of the proposals are actually motivated by pecuniary factors. They are to lessen the probability of some value-destroying incidents or value-destroying risks, and to reduce such risks. And shareholders also know, at least some shareholders know, therefore they vote for the proposals. But there are some reasons not every shareholder votes for the proposals, and these reasons could be due to the fact that these ES agendas are not aligned with long-term value maximization. So shareholders could be short-termed or could want to be more friendly to the management, not to anger the management for other not long-term value maximization reason to not vote for these proposals. Therefore, this means some of the proposals, the support from the shareholders should be informative, but they are not high enough to cross the 50% threshold for the managers, company managers, really to take these proposals into consideration. So an underlying of the hypothesis too is that because shareholders doesn't vote more than 50% of these proposals, therefore the managers never implement these initiatives. So with these two different hypotheses, we actually can form some predictions. So under the hypothesis one, the proposals are motivated by non-pecuniary motives and shareholder knows, therefore the aggregate support of the shareholders should not be informative. It should not predict anything of the firm's future risk or performance or anything. But under the alternative hypothesis, it's actually to prove it, we can see whether the incentive, whether the aggregated votes from the mutual funds or shareholders are predictive of future firm risks. If so, then we can say that the majority of them, although they did not pass, but the aggregated support is informative, meaning there is some consensus there that is informative. So again, and also these are the ES proposals specific. So in this paper, we know that shareholders not just decide on ES issues, they also decide on non-ES issues, and many non-ES issues may also be associated with future firm risk, etc. So, but our prior is that these ES issues are less easy to, are not as easy to evaluate as non-ES issues, and the value implication is not as obvious. Therefore, the shareholders would have more difficulty on deciding the ES issues. So if many shareholders decide that non-ES issues are not useful, therefore they vote these proposals down, maybe they're less informative to the future firm risk, but the ES issues would be more obvious. So we use the non-ES issues as a control mechanism to control for other firm risks that might be related to what we want to predict. So looking at our data, we gain our proposal data from ISS, and many of the categorizations are very detailed in the paper, so you can refer to the paper to see how we classify ES proposals. And we also collect ISS recommendations, sponsor identity, and most important one is the individual mutual fund votes. And we say we look at the future firm financial risk in terms of its tail returns, but we also look at the ES incidents. And these ES incidents come from a database called RepRisk. So basically, it's a technology company that screens all sorts of international news on whether there is an incident that is related to environmental or social issues the company has. So that is our incident data. And empirical analysis can, in terms of its timeline, we can look at in this way. So if we think the company has fiscal year end in end of December, and then in spring they would have the shareholder meeting. During the shareholder meeting, there would be ES and non-ES shareholder proposal proposed by shareholders. And we know that ES proposals or ES issues, they are something long-term. So we look at 2 years proposal data and then see how these voting on the 2 years proposal data can be informative to predict something in the future year. So what do we mean by what is the informative? We think it's not the existence of the ES proposal that is informative, it is the aggregated vote of mutual funds that is informative. Therefore, we have 2 variables here. One is an indicator equals to 1, just to say whether in these 2 meetings there is at least 1 failed ES proposal. And the other is our main variable of interest. We look at what's the aggregate support of mutual fund on these proposals, and whether the variations within this support is informative to predict any future firm risk measured by downside return and ES negative news. And we also control for the existence of non-ES proposal and the aggregated support of these non-ES proposals from the mutual fund as well. And so, for example, I use Valero as an example to indicate this timeline. So this Valero is an energy company. It has a shareholder meeting in spring 2011, and there is a shareholder ES proposal with very high support. Basically, this proposal, the shareholder asked the company to report on their accident risk reduction efforts. And the proposal is recommended to be voted for by ISS, and this proposal actually received fairly high support, or 43%, but still not high enough to pass the 50% threshold. And then we also checked all the company filings, 8Ks, etc. There is no such effort from Valero to actually produce this report, presumably because the proposal did not get passed. And then we observe in a year's time, in December 2012, there is an accident that happened in Valero, and unfortunately the subcontractor got killed and other 2 people were severely injured. And financial wise, the company faced injury lawsuits, so it's not good news. So this illustrates what we are trying to test here. We're looking at past proposals and looking at the support rate among these mutual funds, and then we want to see whether they are predictive of any future either return risk or either these actual lawsuit incidents. So in terms of these financial risk, we look at these 3 variables. One is just a dummy variable that tells whether this firm's return during this year falls below the 25th percentile across all the other firms or not. If so, then it is 1, otherwise no. And the other one is the actual tail return measure. If the firm's tail return falls below the 25th percentile across all the other firms, then we take the return as it is. And in terms of return, what I mean is the 4-factor alpha here. And if not, then it is 0. So the first one is to see the probability of falling into this tail return zone, and the second one is to measure how low it goes. And the third measure is a news measure. So we take the natural log of 1 plus the negative ES news that measured during this period. And our regression is specified here. So we have these three y variables I just discussed that we want to predict, and we control for the existence of ES proposal, control for the existence of non-ES proposal, and the main variable of our interest is the coefficient B2 here. It looks at, given there is an ES proposal, what's the variation in the mutual fund support can tell us about the downside tail return or downside or these negative news. So here is our result. So this dummy variable, the y variable here is the dummy variable indicating whether the firm's return fall into the tail or not. And we can see that the association here is positive. This shows that the more support from mutual funds, the more likely the firm is going to have a tail return. Even though these proposals, these ES proposals, did not get passed. And the second one is looking at the magnitude of how low these return goes, and it's very similar. The more support on ES proposals from the shareholders, the even lower the tail return is. And the more support on the ES issues, the more negative event this firm is going to face in the future. So in terms of magnitude, and also we can see that this effect only comes from the support for ES. We control for the support for non-ES, and there's nothing there. This is in line with what I said, that shareholders valuing ES might be more difficult than valuing non-ES. Therefore, their support here is informative, whereas the support for non-ES is not. And in terms of its magnitude, we can see that it's pretty strong. I will, for the interest of time, I will not read these numbers out, but it's pretty strong, the magnitude. And now we want to tie them together. We are saying that shareholders sort of know these proposals are indicative of something wrong with the firm, therefore they vote for these proposals. Therefore, although these proposals did not get passed, their risk finally realized. And these are the risks that are associated with environmental and social issues. So previously, we just grouped all of them together, and we want to say a bit more on, indeed, the E issues are related to E event and S issues are related to S event. So we try to separate these E and S negative news, and we find indeed the support for E proposals can predict a future E negative event. Same for the social event as well. So now what we have seen is that the mutual fund aggregate support is informative. It can predict these two things, and we want to tie these two things together. We're only inferring that these incidents leading to these tail return events, are they actually so or not? So we look at for each firm, during the period we measure its alpha, we can actually divide it into two different periods. One is the alphas measured on the day when there is no incident. The other period is the alphas measured on the day with incidents. And then we can average out across these firms and then compare the alphas on incidence day and on non-incidence day. And we do find indeed those alphas are more negative on incidence days, whereas on non-incidence days, the alpha is almost zero. So it confirms that these these ES incidents does lead to these low tail returns. So this is the main findings of the paper. And then I have very few minutes. I'll just briefly talk about our final result. We're saying that these mutual fund aggregate support is indeed informative, but why these proposals still didn't get passed? And we had these two hypotheses to explain. Maybe they are short-term focused, but ES proposals are somewhat long-term, and maybe also they have suffered some agency problems. They want to please the management, not to publicly oppose the management. Therefore, they do not support these proposals. So we run a regression at a fund proposal level, and we have measures for fund short-termism using the flow performance sensitivity, and we use how the fund in the past had voted for the management as a measure of management friendliness. and we find these results. We find the more short-term funds, the less likely they are to support these ES proposals, and the more friendly to the management fund, the less likely they're supporting these proposals. And also another interesting thing is the interaction here. So here we interact management friendliness with when the company management had an earning target to beat. If the firm is short-termed that year, it barely exceeds zero earning, then these friendly funds have even more incentive to please the management to vote these ES proposals down. So that's another finding we have. So far we have seen, indeed, there are some cases when the funds are very short-term and not and friendly to the management. They don't want to vote for these proposals. So as a last test, we want to tie all the loose ends together. We want to see whether, because we said those proposals are in aggregate support is informative, but for some reasons the funds are not voting for these proposals. So we see whether those funds that doesn't suffer from short-termism or doesn't have the need to please the management, is their aggregate vote informative compared to those funds that do suffer from short-termism or need to be friendly to the management? And we find indeed so. So this is the same regression as the main analysis. We just split the support rate into two different groups. One is from those long horizon, non-management friendly funds. The other is those who suffer from short-termism or agency problems. And we find indeed it is those who do not suffer from these problems, their aggregated support is informative. It can predict future alpha, it can predict future negative news. So overall, our findings suggests that these ES proposals do have some value implications, and some of the shareholders can distinguish these proposals and relate to firm future risks. But because of short-termism or some agency issues, these proposals didn't get passed, and therefore the negative impact is realized in these firms. And we have some other extended robustness tests, which I will not bore you, but you can have a look in the paper if that's appropriate. Yeah, so that's all my presentation.
Helen, thank
yeah.
you so much for your presentation. The presentation will be very, very clear. Now, I don't know if there are questions, are welcome. Otherwise, we can switch to discussion by Professor Petrella.
May I ask a question?
Okay, please.
This is Nelda Sotis. I would like, I don't know if I have caught everything, but I would like to ask how the degree of support to the shareholders' proposal is measured. How do you assess the degree of support as in the case the shareholders' proposal is not approved? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Nelda, for your question. So we measure the aggregate support by, so we can observe whether a mutual fund vote for or against the proposal, even though the proposal did not get passed. So we can count how, on average, among these mutual funds, what's the percentage of voting for, and then use that as a proxy for the degree of support.
That's right, thank you.
There are other questions, or we can go on? Okay, I think we have time also at the end of the discussion. So, Professor Petrella, please, you can share your screen, and then you can present your discussion.
Thank you. Thank you. I just tried to share my screen.
Okay, we see
Let's
your
check
screen.
whether it works, which is always something that we have to double check. Is now okay for you? Do you see my screen, my full
Yes.
my presentation?
Yeah.
Yes, we see your screen. Everything's fine, Professor.
Very well, thank you. So thanks also for inviting me to discuss this paper. And in my comments, I will mainly focus on the second part that was presented by Ellen. So the part on the value of these failed ES proposal with respect to the future risks and returns of the stocks. So let me just start with just a couple of words on the big picture. I will be brief, as already Daniela Costa mentioned in the introductory speech. The paper deals with the relevant topic. I found in this paper two very important topics. The first one is the ESG risk factor. That is an additional risk factor that needs to be included in the pricing structure. Plus a second main topic that I appreciated in this paper is the monitoring by asset managers, because this is also another important point. We need to have, financial markets need to have monitors for the behavior of the companies, and so also the role played by asset manager is important in that respect. Second point, in terms of the big picture, is also that this paper is very timely, and we all know that the ESG topic is important. There is an important piece of regulation that will be in place starting from this year. The disclosure about the ESG factor is something that is very important. As Ellen mentioned in her presentation, we know that the assessment of these ESG risk is not particularly easy, because also the tools that we have in our toolbox need to be appropriately developed with respect to this specific dimension of risk, and so market participants are learning how to deal with it. Meanwhile, the topic is very timely, as I said. Asset managers increasingly prefer to invest in more sustainable firms, and asset managers consider sustainability information, especially for what concerns climate. Climate change is particularly relevant. Some industry actors distinguish between green stocks, brown stocks, so it's something that is also important from a practical standpoint. And lastly, some asset managers also engage on sustainability issues with companies they have. So let's move forward to the paper. What about the paper? The paper studies failed ES proposals at shareholder meetings. And it's also interesting to note that the ES proposals, at least so far, almost never crosses the 50% threshold to be approved. This is something that I don't know if in some time in the future this will be still true, because what I see is that the awareness with respect to the ESG risk is increasing over time, and so I think that it is also important to monitor the trend with respect to this type of evidence. The paper looks at, as I said, at failed ES proposals, and more specifically, failed ES proposals appear to predict negative returns following the rejection of the proposal at the shareholder meeting. And that's a second finding. So the first finding is this prediction of the negative return, And the second finding is this information about ES-related risks that the firm is facing. As Ellen mentioned and well clarified, it is important to understand that it is the investor support level. So how strong, what is the level of the support for the individual ES proposal that actually contains information about the future risks that firms face. And additionally, some findings of the paper also look at the relationship between the support of the ES proposals that failed and the probability of getting a negative returns coming from originated by a future ES incident. And so the key words here are the failed ES proposals, because that's the starting point of the paper. Then the next step is that the paper observes a negative return, or if we wish, a negative tail, a tailed return, as Ellen clarified in the presentation. And this negative return is basically the outcome of a risk. And then there is this claim made by the paper about the importance of ES-related risks, also on the basis of the ES incidents. In the second part of the paper looks at why do we have a failure of the proposal at the shareholder meeting, and the explanation that is proposed by the paper is mainly related to the so-called agency frictions. And so the null hypothesis in that respect is that the ES proposals are not value maximizers, and if this is the case, so the proposals are rejected simply because they do not maximize firm value, and this is the reason why they are rejected. Otherwise, that's the alternative hypothesis, they do not pass, they are rejected for other agency-related reasons like investor myopia and friendliness toward management. And the two pieces of evidence that Ellen also mentioned in her presentation are that more short-term funds are less likely to vote for the ES proposal. So when the fund is short-term oriented, we have this lower likelihood of voting for the ES proposal. And the second finding is that greater friendliness is associated with the lower probability of voting for this type of proposal. Now let's turn to my comment, and about my comment. For the sake of clarity, I organized my comment in four points. Number one is about the framework and the anecdotal evidence. And in that respect, I think that also my presentation matches quite well with Ellen's presentation. The second one is about the link between ES negative news and subsequent negative returns. The third point is interpretation of findings, and then some robustness checks. Let's start with the first point, the framework. The paper proposes that it is possible to predict this downside risk on the basis of the degree of support for failed ES proposals. So the paper finds this relationship between the degree of support at the shareholder meeting for ES proposals, and so this failure is positively correlated with negative returns later on. And this is the timeline. The timeline is that I observe a negative return in year T, this one, a negative return, downside tail return, and then this is correlated with what happens in year T minus 2 shareholder meeting, or in year T-1 shareholder meeting, and in one of the two shareholder meetings, then there is a failed ES proposal. So this is basically the framework or the setting of the empirical analysis. On that respect, my comment is, what happens if we define differently the measurement period for the subsequent return? You know, the fact that we consider two possible shareholder meetings, you know, I have one shareholder meeting here, and then I consider 2 years later, or I have one shareholder meeting at that time, and I consider the negative return, or generally speaking, the return 1 year later. So I have these two possibilities that are, this is a key point of this paper. And so my question is, what happens if we use a more, let's say, linear way to define the relationship between what happens at the shareholder meeting and what happens in terms of return in the market later on? This comment is also somehow related to the anecdotal evidence. I will be brief in that respect, because this was also covered by Ellen in her presentation. And the paper, you know, when I read papers, I usually like to have an illustrative example that I can think about, and this as conveying the main message of the paper. And so I read carefully this example based on Valero Energy at the 2011 meeting, April 2011 meeting. There was a proposal to provide a report on accident risk reduction efforts. ISS recommended voting for. However, the proposal did not pass. The support, however, was quite high. It was 43%. And then the paper states that, consistent with the presence of safety-related risks that were not adequately addressed, in December 2012, so 1 year and a half later, with respect to the date of the shareholder meeting, the media reported that a subcontractor was killed and that there was an important accident at the Valero's Memphis refinery. The incident then became the subject of a costly wrongful death and injury lawsuit. So this was the anecdotal evidence, and so I tried to match the anecdotal evidence with the timeline that was previously mentioned, that it is used in this paper. And so the shareholder meeting is the 2011 meeting, so I can have 2011 here, and if I use 2011 in that respect, I have 2013 as the year T return, or I can have 2011 here, and so the next year will be the 2012 as the return that I am going to look at in terms of the relationship between the failed ES proposal and the subsequent return. Well, what I found when I looked at the behavior of the stock price, and Valero is basically FLO, the blue line. Well, the blue line tells us that in 2012 the stock went up 62% and the Standard & Poor went up 13%. In 2013 the stock went up 62% again, and the Standard & Poor's went up 30%. So I think that this is somehow not puzzling, because, you know, this is just one example and it's one observation within a sample. However, and I also checked with an event study on the announcement date, because we also have this December 2012 date, what happens in the market, and actually there were no negative abnormal returns or also in that period of time. So what I simply suggest to include some anecdotal evidence that matches with the main messages of the paper, so that also the reader will find easier to grasp the message of the paper. Next comment deals with the link between the negative returns and the ES incidents. The paper also includes an analysis with respect to the relationship between ES-related news and the degree of support for failed ES proposals. And the paper finds a positive relationship. So basically, again, we have the degree of support that can be used in order to predict somehow the occurrence of negative news that are ES-related. We also know that we have the first part of the empirical analysis that says, look, the subsequent negative returns are explained by the degree of support for failed ES proposal. And so there are two, let's say, evidences that go together. And so I think that the paper also provides some evidence with respect an even study about the what happens in the market and what is the market reaction to the ES accidents, as I mentioned earlier. But I'm not really sure that the even study is enough in order to claim that the failed ES proposals is actually able to predict a negative return later on that is explained by ES risks. We may find an association, but I think that we might need to double check, and that's my comment here, whether and especially how much the negative return that we observe 1 year later or 2 years later are actually driven by ES negative news, because otherwise we have an issue with omitted factors. So I see that there is this relationship between failed ES proposals and tail returns. So actually there are negative returns later on, but I'm not sure that these negative returns are by definition evidence of a risk, because this is the outcome of a risk. However, I think that it would be nice to have some more evidence about the fact that this negative return that is observed in the market is actually the outcome of the ES risks that are actually materializing. Next comment deals with the interpretation of the findings. The paper, as I said, studies the failed ES proposals at the shareholder meeting, and how do we explain such proposals did not pass? Number one, as I said, they are not considered to maximize the value of the firm. Alternative hypothesis is that they do not pass for agency-related reasons. I would also like to state that we also have an intermediate hypothesis, because we probably also need to take into account that the uncertainty about the benefits of the ES proposals might not be very well perceived at the time of the decision by the shareholder meeting, because especially in the past, probably the awareness and the perception of the market participant with respect to the ESG factor was not as skilled as it is probably today. And so greater competence and greater skill in the evaluation of the risk, this is something that changes over time. And in my view, also when we discuss the impact of the BP Deepwater Horizon disaster in 2010, which is basically the beginning of the sample period for this study, this is something that it's hard to classify with H1 null hypothesis. They are not value maximizer, or H0, sorry, or H1, they are evidence of agency frictions. Because I might be value maximizer, but I might be unable to assess in a precise way the risks that I'm facing. And in that respect, also the negative, the failed proposal might find an explanation in this difficulty, greater difficulty to understand and to assess the importance of this risk, especially in the previous part of the sample period. Lastly, just a few minor points. well, this is again about the abnormal returns of the days on negative ES incidents. Given that the paper claims that the failed ES proposals at the shareholder meeting 2 years prior to the negative return is able to convey information about what happens later on, I think that this is something that needs to be very well clarified. Also, as I said, in terms of how big is how much those abnormal returns are able to explain the full negative tail returns that are considered in the main regression. Or otherwise, what are the factors, all the factors that actually explain the negative return in the measurement period year T, in order to have an idea of how, what's the role played by the ES factor with respect to other factors. And also, I think that it would be also useful to add some statistics on the alpha factor, comparing firms with failed ES proposal, firms with failed non-ES proposal, and firms with no failed proposals at all, just to have a complete picture. Let me just conclude. I think that we learn with this paper, we learn two important points. Number one is that failed ES proposals are useful to predict negative returns later on. Number two is that failed ES proposal contains some information about the risks, generally speaking, that firms face, and I'm not sure whether we can classify those risks as all ES related, or also there are other risks that actually materialize and are able to fully explain the negative returns that we observe after a failed ES proposal. Additionally, I also would like to highlight that there are relevant implications from this paper at two levels, let's say. One is from an investor perspective, because thanks to this paper, investors should pay attention to those proposals that did not pass, as they are associated with increased downside risk. You know, I don't want to enter into the question of what is the source of the risk, but the evidence is pretty clear that there is this relationship with a negative tail return later on. And on a different dimension, I think that the findings of this paper might also be relevant for supervisors, as they might want to scrutinize companies with failed ES proposal, as this might be a signal, at least potentially, that the ES risks are not appropriately monitored by the company. And that's all. Thanks again for the presentation and for these opportunity to discuss the paper.
Professor Petrella, thank you so much for discussion. I appreciate in particular your suggestion about the difficulty to value the risk of this type of proposal regarding environment and social. So it's very important to understand this fact, because it's clear that this uncertainty is a sort of it's something that it's not useful to support this proposal, and so it's but I think that more study in this direction are welcome in this case, in order to specify better the risk connected with the proposal in environmental, and so to find in particular how to evaluate this type of risk. There are new, it's not very easy to evaluate. So let's turn to Helen in order to, I don't know if Helen, do you have some question to Professor or observation to Professor Petrella? And then let's go to the question if there are by the audience.
Yes, thank you, Professor Petrella, for all the comments. Yes, I really like your summary of our paper. It's a really nice summary, and I like the final implication part as well. That's something we actually haven't really thought about, what's the implication. But I share some of your concerns about our timeline is a little bit unusual. For two reasons. We want to we first know that these ES either risks or concerns, they are somewhat embedded in the firm and is not so easy to come up. So you can say a company has governance issues, and maybe very quickly the company would have conducted a fraud and be discovered, because in the industry it's so easy to relatively easy to discover fraud than to have an accident. So what we're trying to do is to look for something in the long term. So instead of prolonging our Y variable to be measured in the long term, we look at our X variable to occur over 2 years. We also try to look at just 1 year. The prediction, the effect is still there, but maybe we should tweak a little bit in terms of how we want to capture this long-term effect. The other reason is a lot of people would comment on those funds. They voted against these proposals. They voted for these proposals, but then the proposal didn't get passed. Therefore, they just dumped the shares instead. So we don't want to capture the immediate divestment. So we left a gap in the middle. So for these two reasons, we looked at the following fiscal year. That's our judgment. Yeah. And in terms of tying these negative return to negative ES event, indeed. So what we are trying to capture in terms of these returns, we are getting the idiosyncratic return of these firms. So we are saying that the ES incidents are firm specific. So we are estimating the alpha firm per firm based on its previous performance, and then we look at its alpha in relative its previous performance and these other factors. So basically we are trying to capture the idiosyncratic return of the firm to tie it to these incidents. So we're not trying to say that the ES risk is another factor. We are there in the literature. There are two ideas now. One is saying that these are a standalone factor. Another is saying that these are standalone firm effects. So we are following the standalone firm effects. So that's why we only look at on incidence day what's the average alpha, on non-incidence day what's the average alpha, whether on incidence day the negative alpha is more negative or not. And in terms of the medium hypothesis, yes, definitely. So we are viewing these proposals as something to reduce value destroying activity instead of introducing some value increasing activity. So we are focusing everything on the negative end, and that's clearer for us. So that's why we have these two competing hypotheses. But we can think of whether how to introduce some positive side into the equation. Yeah. So I will definitely ask you for the slides. I'm sure I have missed something, but yes, thank you for your comments. It's very, very good. Yeah.
It was a pleasure. Thanks. You very well written the paper. I will send you the slides immediately.
Thank you.
Perfect. Now, if we have 5 minutes, if there are other questions, are welcome, or curiosity, anything.
I got a question for Professor.
Okay.
I would like to ask this thing. Don't you think that if markets should recognize and accept the predictive power of failed yes proposal, that would generate a negative effect? I mean, if so, managers won't make a specific yes proposal not to make shareholders and market think that yes, accidents or negative events are likely to occur in short times. So what do you think about it? Thanks.
I'm not sure. I'm not quite sure I get the entire question. Are you saying that if these negative events are just idiosyncratic, managers shouldn't really care about these idiosyncratic events, or is it something different?
Yeah, something like this. I mean, if you're right, that would be can cause just a negative reaction because no, you know, managers want or companies want make a specific yes proposal about a new policy because not just because of the effect of the news effect it can take. I mean, that can be just declaring there a risk, several risks is probably to occur. So it would be in some way interesting but negative, and so this will prevent companies to make yes proposal on the long term.
So my understanding is so from a company perspective, anything, even its idiosyncratic event, idiosyncratic return is bad for the company. But for the asset managers, they obviously can say that some of these idiosyncratic risks can be diversified away, etc. And that might not give them incentive to vote for these proposals. But for the company itself, this is bad event. So this is similar to these financial distress risks. I suppose when the firm is in distress, it's an idiosyncratic firm thing, but it's not a overall market risk there. But still, investors care about these standalone and events. So I guess it's something that there's a line between when things can be diversified away. Do you still care about it or not? If the negative impact is large enough, and when does these idiosyncratic event becomes more systematic in the market? We also don't know. So I think it's a deeper question that we cannot really easily answer here. Yeah.
Yes, thanks. Maybe you just get the point, and that's the reporting. I think that the only way not to incur in such a problem, it's the widespread of ESG reporting. If it's something that every company does, it wouldn't be a significant alert for a specific risk. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
I may contribute on that question. I think that I fully agree on the fact that if we have a full coverage of the ESG risk in a standard and also in a mandatory reporting document, that's actually something that will avoid the issue of self-selection and self-disclosing that there is an issue, a potential risk. That I think this is the concern that was raised, and so I agree with the fact that the mandatory reporting could solve this type of issue. With respect to the Yellen paper, actually the setting is very specific because the proposal failed ES proposal in Ellen paper are basically proposed by shareholders, so they are not proposed by the management currently in charge. So they are shareholders that try to put this item in the agenda of the shareholder meeting. And probably the idea is not to have this negative event occurring just immediately, but the idea is, let's raise the point, let's make the decision in the good direction, and if the company takes the right direction, this would be value maximizing. By contrast, if we don't get it done, actually there are 2 years later, there will be the materialization of the risks that we are taking because of this type of approach. I think that's basically what the main message of Ellen paper, at least in my understanding, but Ellen knows much better.
Okay, other question? I think no. So I think we can say thank you. Thank you for join. Thank you for to everyone to join this webinar. Thank you to Helen here for presentation, and thank you to Professor Petrella Giovanni for a very interesting discussion, very clear discussion. And I'm looking for a new webinar. Thank you so much. See you soon. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you all.